All right, so today we're going to wrap up Chapter 31 on World War II. Again, my apologies that we don't have a video for the first half. But quick recap, we talked about the things that caused World War II, especially as compared to World War I. You saw three of the same causes between the two wars. Which ones were they? Right. Militarism, alliances, not the I. Militarism, alliances, and nationalism. We said man caused both wars. Nobody was terribly impressed. And then we ran through kind of the major events of the war up until we stopped with, I believe it was the Holocaust, right?
We finished the Holocaust, so we have to do island hopping.
Okay. So we talked about the German Blitzkrieg through Central Europe as the spark that kicks off World War II after all of those longer-term causes, and the invasion of France, where France gets pretty much annihilated, but southern France remains free. Sort of. And the Battle of Britain, where the British, after a long drawn-out Nazi bombing campaign, ultimately survive and push back the German Air Force and gain themselves a brief reprieve. And we talked a little bit about how Hitler sends one of his top commanders, Erwin Rommel, to Africa to secure the oil fields, and then they have fun off-roading adventures down there in their tanks. And then Hitler breaks the non-aggression pact with Russia and invades, and the turning point in that conflict is the Battle of Stalingrad, where Hitler once again becomes yet another footnote in history that falls victim to Russian winter. And then we talked about Pearl Harbor and how Pearl Harbor actually made sense from the Japanese standpoint because we had already made it clear pretty much which side we were supporting. We had cut off our trade with them. We continued to support the Allies. And the Japanese recognized that we were the only viable threat to their empire in the Pacific, so if they can get our Navy out of the way, they can't be touched, and it almost worked. Then we talked a little bit about D-Day, the kind of all-or-nothing Allied invasion of northern France in an attempt to begin to push back the Nazis and regain a foothold in Europe. And it worked, and there's all kinds of amazing stories about D-Day that we just did not get into because we needed to talk about the Holocaust. And the big thing we wanted you to walk away from with the Holocaust was that it was a three-phase plan. It was not death and genocide from day one. It starts with Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, and the attempt to get Jews to simply leave. It then goes to rounding up the Jews in phase two and locking them up in ghetto, some of the worst apartment blocks in major cities where you cram them 10, 15, 20 to a room, turn off most of the running water, and subject them to horrible living conditions until phase three, which is the genocide, the concentration camps, the death camps, all of that horrific, horrific stuff that stays with us to this day.
Now, during phase two, were they doing stuff like small-level genocide where they kill all the Jews at one town?
Yeah. Yeah, you don't see the high levels of execution during ghetto. Ghetto is still very much organizational. There's still too much value to be gained from the Jews at that point. Plus, the other thing to remember, and I don't think we mentioned this last class, Hitler has to find people willing to engage in genocide. He can't pull the trigger on 12 million people himself. And so it takes time to build up an organization within the Nazi Party, like the SS, like the Gestapo, like whomever, that are willing to carry out this sort of very, very methodical, sociopathic killing. And you can't just advertise for those people in the newspaper. All right, so we had three events left to cover before the war ends. And it's all dealing with primarily the United States fighting the Japanese in the Pacific. And again, much like with our coverage of the European theater of the war, there's a million stories to be told, and we have time for exactly none of them. So again, we are not doing justice to the war itself because we really need to get to the point that we can look at what this war does to the world, because that's what AP World is all about. If we offered a military history course, this would be like half our curriculum, but we don't.
War is the world. It's a war. You are fighting a war on every continent in the world except Antarctica. That's what's happening to the world.
Yeah, but that needs to be unpacked way, way more than all these individual battles. Okay, so war in the Pacific. The United States strategy is called island hopping. That's the process that takes us from island to island to island across the Pacific, pushing back the Japanese forces, reclaiming territory, trying not to leave significant Japanese forces behind us as we move on, although obviously it's a little bit inevitable in some cases. This becomes some of the ugliest fighting in the war, largely because both sides, but especially the United States, had done an excellent job of dehumanizing their opponent, much like the way that the Nazis had done the Jews, where they aren't people anymore. They aren't deserving of human compassion. They aren't deserving of humane treatment. This is somebody that needs to be wiped out, almost like you eradicate the weeds in your garden. You know, I don't really think too much about the feelings of the weeds when I take my weed killer and spray down my sidewalk. I just want to get rid of them. That becomes very much the mentality in the Pacific Campaign. Yes, Nick?
But didn't the Japanese not help themselves by doing stuff like never surrendering or executing prisoners in horrible, gruesome ways?
Well, and that's one of the things we need to talk about as we talk about the war in the Pacific. And this is not meant as any sort of excuse. It's simply tactical. The Japanese realized that as the war in Europe was turning around and that the Nazis were probably going to lose, they don't have anybody left on their side. And the entire world, it seems like, is now more or less unified against them as the last great Axis threat. Italy has switched sides. They've overthrown Mussolini. They publicly executed him. And the new Italian government quickly joins the Allies. Stalin has absolutely joined forces with the Allies as well, especially once Hitler breaks his non-aggression pact. And so if you look at the countries that are available to support Japan, there aren't any. Nobody is going to jump to Japan's defense and help them. And so from Japan's standpoint, if you're fighting a losing battle, how do you make sure you don't get absolutely annihilated? One of the few remaining tools you have at your disposal is psychological warfare. And so if you refuse to ever surrender, if you refuse to treat prisoners of war with anything resembling humanity, it becomes readily apparent to your opponent that this is a scary, scary, scary fight. And much like they were thinking with Pearl Harbor, maybe if we scare them enough early on, they'll stop. Now, that, again, does not fit with the American psyche of we will never surrender. We will happily do whatever outrageous thing we want to do prior to surrendering. Surrendering is never an option. And so you have two conflicting military ideologies here. On the one hand, you have the we are going to never quit, never, never, never quit, and hopefully scare you into stopping. And on the American side, it's we're never going to quit. We're coming, you're not going to stop us, you better just surrender. Both sides have essentially, in some ways, the same mentality, and those are not going to be terribly complementary.
Just different ways of acting.
Right. And so it almost turns into one of those games of chicken. Not the one in the pool with people on your shoulders, but the one in cars driving at each other at breakneck pace, looking to see who's going to swerve first. And in this case, neither country wants to be the one to swerve. Nick?
I thought that the Japanese had that ideology from the beginning because they had gone and mangled the old Bushido samurai code so that they could indoctrinate their people into this culture.
Right, and again, some of that has to do with the fact that they are largely isolated. That even if the Nazis can keep the rest of Europe occupied, there's nobody in the Asian theater to help them out. So anyway, you're going to get a large number of very, very deadly battles, many of them naval, many of them involving aircraft taking off from aircraft carriers and then trying to return. And so then aircraft carriers obviously become a big, big target. There are any number of battles that take place as the United States crosses the Pacific. The Battle of Midway, the Battle of Guadalcanal, the Battle of Iwo Jima, the Battle of the Coral. Like there's so many. And it brings us some of the most memorable snapshots of the war. I'm assuming you guys have at least seen this before, even if you had no idea where this was taken.
Yeah, Iwo Jima, not Suribachi.
Right. So the Battle of Iwo Jima, and the funny thing about this picture is this one's actually staged, because the first time they raised the flag, they had to take it back down because it was still under fire. So then they have to re-raise it for the commemorative photo. But that's okay. It in no way detracts from kind of the moving nature of that picture. We also get one like this, and this is an SOL question, by the way. They will sometimes show you this picture and say, who is this? Right, and so unless you are a significant World War II buff, most of you would look at this picture and go, I don't know, some president? Yeah. This is Douglas MacArthur. He is the Allied commander in the Pacific. You see the stars on his collar. The most famous piece is his corncob pipe, much like Frosty the Snowman, with two eyes made out of aviators, but apart from there, the semblance ends. MacArthur is going to lead the campaign all the way across the Pacific Ocean. He's going to help to liberate a number of Pacific Island nations, and he will ultimately oversee the surrender of the Japanese once all this is said and done. Now, once most of the Pacific has been retaken, the United States is weighing their options, and they figure that they really only have two. Either invade the island of Japan like they've invaded all the other ones, or try to find some other way to get the Japanese to surrender. Now, the problem with invading, most of the American military experts agreed, was that based on the fighting they had seen in all these other islands, the Japanese would absolutely not surrender, much like they had not surrendered on any of the other islands. Except if you invade Japan, every man, woman, and child in Japan is going to be fighting you, rather than just the remnants of the soldiers. Well, not just genocide, but they were thinking about the losses to the Allied soldiers, which would, they said, number in the millions. And so what they were looking for was a better alternative. And the better alternative began with conventional bombing of the island of Japan. Flights of B-29s and B-52s flying over the island. Fine, B-29s and B-17s. Does that work better? Okay. They're dropping lots of bombs. I apologize for getting the numbers of the models of the planes wrong. I realize this is deeply personal to some people. In any case, if you look at Japan and its architecture, Japan's architecture, like many places, is primarily constructed out of wood. Which means then when you drop incendiary bombs on cities made largely out of wood, guess what happens? There's a lot of fire. And so the United States Air Force and Navy were causing significant amounts of damage, even with conventional bombing. But the problem was the Japanese were not surrendering, even with all of this loss of life and property. And so it's at that point that the new president of the United States, because President Roosevelt has since passed away in office, the new president has been informed that he has the keys to a brand new, fairly cool weapon called the atomic bomb. Now, this was actually news to him because the project, the Manhattan Project, had actually been started under President Roosevelt and hadn't really become common knowledge to, well, certainly nobody in society, and even within government, most people weren't aware that this existed. And President Truman had only been in office for a little bit more than half a year when this knowledge is brought to his attention, just as he's looking for a way to make the Japanese surrender. David.
My grandfather worked on the Manhattan Project.
Nice. That's pretty cool.
I think he was one of the designers for it.
That's awesome. Well, they had a whole bunch of really smart people out in the desert in New Mexico. Can you let me tell it? I do know some of this.
I think he still has his bachelor. He never goes back.
That's pretty cool. I mean, other than the B-52s, I feel like I'm doing pretty well so far. So, out in New Mexico, in Los Alamos, The U.S. military is constructing the secret site where they can conduct research and do experiments on nuclear energy, specifically in terms of finding a way to weaponize it. What they find is they're able to do it, at least in theory. And so they build a weapon that, rather than working off of traditional explosives, creates an explosion using either, and they create both options, using either nuclear fusion or nuclear fission. In either case, it makes a really, really big boom. Those aren't exactly the words that they used in their papers, but it comes close. When President Truman is presented with this information, he sees it as a way not only of forcing the Japanese to end the war early by demonstrating such awesome destructive power, but he also sees it as a way of getting prepared for the post-war world. Because in the post-war world, he already foresees us playing a significant role. Because when you look at all the other dominant powers in the world, is there anybody else that is in as good a shape as we are at the moment?
We're the only ones who haven't been destroyed by the war.
Right. If you look at Western Europe, which has been the dominant power for the last 500 years, they're in shambles. I mean, 2 consecutive world wars in under 40 years has left them ruined. And Russia, even as they're pushing back the Germans and trying to rebuild internally at the same time, they're not in great shape. And China, a perennial world power, still is wrestling with this whole westernization concept and doesn't really seem to want to. And so now if Japan is destroyed, the other up-and-coming Asian power, there's nobody left. Nobody in Latin America represents a significant enough economic and military threat. Nobody in Africa, which is still largely under European control, represents any sort of economic or military threat. Australia, I don't know. There is no one else. And so President Truman sees this as a wonderful opportunity to kind of put the rest of the world in its place and show them just how powerful the United States has become. And so when the order is given to drop the atomic bomb, even then they had some decisions to make. Do we want to open this up to a public test? Do we want to invite the leaders of the nations to witness this and see the awesome power that we have? And assume at that point they're going to go, holy crap, we surrender. And or, can we please be your best friends? Oh, right, or can we have that? To which the immediate response would have been, no. Or, do we drop it someplace not heavily populated so that people can witness its destructive power without incurring a significant loss of life? Or, do we drop it on enemy territory, on one of the remaining cities in Japan that we have not yet touched with conventional bombing, in order to fully illustrate its destructive power and at the same time encourage our enemy to surrender? They go with that option.
They do B and C because they first do a test after.
Well, they test it to make sure it works, because you don't want to plan on cataclysmic destruction only to have it hit the ground and go thunk. Because that would be kind of embarrassing and totally defeats your efforts at getting your enemy to be intimidated. So they do a test run in the desert of Mexico, and they bring out a whole bunch of, American military personnel to witness it. And the scientists, prior to the blast, some of them are taking bets on whether or not it's going to ignite all the oxygen in the atmosphere and destroy the atmosphere and therefore life on Earth as well. Thankfully it didn't, but the fact that the people that created it were taking bets on whether or not it would scares me.
Is that real?
Mm-hmm.
Although it's also a theory that in order to create an atomic bomb, you need more uranium than it was on the Earth.
Right. And again, it really just demonstrates that they didn't really know for sure. And at that point, I would imagine there were people in the military that said, well, the only way we're going to find out is test it, so let's go. And I'm sure some of the scientists were like, I don't know about that. Why don't we wait a little bit? But they didn't wait, and they tested it, and the explosion was just as spectacular as they were hoping for. The radiation was just as spectacular, but nobody knew what that was yet. And any number of people in the vicinity were subjected to very unhealthy levels of radiation, but, you know, that happens.
And they got cancer.
So then what happens?
So how they look at how far away then the radiation effects compared to the blast area?
Oh.
You know?
Well, the radiation carries much further because of the wind than just the immediate blast radius. So, I mean, depending on the wind, I mean, it's miles. Miles. We'll show you some pictures of the blast radius once the bomb is actually dropped. And even those are amazingly destructive. So, I mean, you have multiple city blocks here that are completely annihilated, except for where, bizarrely, some buildings were left standing.
That's a pretty heavy wood.
And I'm probably going to get my dates wrong, so I'll apologize, but the first bomb is dropped August 3rd, 1945, from the Enola Gay, flying over the city of Hiroshima, one of the cities that had been completely untouched by conventional bombing and firebombing, so that it could illustrate the devastating impact of the atomic bomb. It was dropped without warning, no announcement of what was coming, and then the demand was made that the Japanese surrender unconditionally, which had been our demand all along. Now, what right. And what we meant by unconditional surrender was that the emperor, especially, had to step down and remove himself from power. And the problem with that in Japan, and one of the reasons why that was slowing down the process of surrender, I don't know how much you guys remember about the Japanese religion of Shinto, but what role does the emperor play in Shintoism? Right, he is essentially a god. And so asking the emperor to step down is also asking the Japanese to effectively give up their Shinto faith. That's a little hard to swallow. Not to mention the fact that when the emperor and his top generals receive word that most of the city has been annihilated by one bomb dropped from one plane, it's not surprising that they probably thought the survivors that brought them that story were a little out of their mind. And at that point, it takes time to go and confirm the story, to send advisors. And he comes back going, nope, whole city's gone. Everybody says it was one bomb. And somebody above him goes, I don't believe that. I'm going to go look. And he goes and checks out. He comes back, nope, whole city's gone. Everybody says one plane, one bomb. The emperor's like, I don't know. This doesn't seem right. Nobody can do this. Nobody's heard about this. And then the second bomb drops. Again, no warning. August 6th, 3 days later, on the city of Nagasaki. And again, in both cases, it's dropped over the heart of the city. So maximum loss of population, maximum destruction of buildings, maximum impact. And following that bombing, the Japanese surrender within a day or two. Why drop a second bomb? And there's multiple reasons, and you're not allowed to talk yet. Why drop two bombs, Stephen? What's that? Yes. Okay, so one reason is to make sure both kinds work. Why else, Trina? Okay, so another reason is to show our determination that we are not going to stop and we're going to use whatever means we have to end this war. Sahil? It's not a one-time thing. The first one was no accident. If you drop one and only one, what might some people think?
A one-shot one, you only have one.
You only have one, or maybe it was a fluke, and you hit, oil refinery, and the explosion was like 10 times bigger than you thought it was going to be, and you got lucky. If you drop two and you get more or less the same result, it shows the entire world we can do this again. That very much gets to the president's desire to control the post-war world and show to both allies and enemies, this is what you're up against. Well, what this also opens the door to, though, is as soon as we show that we have this degree of military technology and this... Exactly. And so you're going to get something immediately following the war called the nuclear arms race, where the Soviet Union is quickly trying to get their hands on the same technology to level the playing field. All right, so that ends the war.
And then you still have countries today trying to achieve it.
Right. And even today, you have countries like Iran that are trying to achieve the technology and the ability to have a nuclear weapon of their own, because once a country possesses it, it gives them a distinct advantage, because you don't want to mess with a country that has a bomb that can wipe out a large chunk of a city, especially if you've given them now 20 years to develop thousands of those, because you send a fleet of planes and you wipe out most of a country. That makes other countries feel very, very, very uneasy and makes them want to have that same sort of protection. All right, so one of the last things that comes up at the end of the war is a recommitment to the idea that we should never, ever, 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 ever have a global conflict like this again. And they noticed that where the League of Nations was a good idea in principle, it really lacked the authority to do much of anything when it comes to stopping war.
And so they revised it and they were United Nations.
Yep. And so they revised it and they created a new organization, the United Nations, which has pretty much the same mission: to prevent large-scale conflicts, to take care of people's needs around the world, and to have a way of actually enforcing their will. And so the United Nations has both economic weapons and military weapons at its disposal as a means of trying to prevent countries from pursuing a path of conflict and war. And interestingly enough, its headquarters is in New York City.
Isn't that also where the League of Nations is headquartered?
No, League of Nations was in Switzerland. You know, the epitome of neutrality.
When was the last time Switzerland fought a war or something?
I don't know. They have sweet knives and chocolate, though. All right, so that's the war in a very, very small nutshell. Emily? An economic weapon would be like trade restrictions, freezing a country's international assets, placing tariffs on their goods, encouraging other countries to not trade with them or buy their products, things like that. All right, so war is over. There's a map. Outcome of the war for everybody else. And we're going to break this up into 3 areas, more or less. And we can talk about a 4th as well. We look at the colonies that were formerly owned by European nations. And at the end of World War I, the colonies of the losing nations, especially Germany, some were given their independence, but most of the others were seized. Now, they had all been hoping, hey, maybe if Germany loses, we'll get our freedom from Germany. And then it was, nope, we're just going to have another European country take us over instead. And the colonies that supported the Allies in World War I were operating under the assumption that if we do a really, really good job of helping them out, maybe we'll get our independence after the war as a thank you. And that didn't happen. And so as World War II comes to an end, you see even more frustration and resentment of Europeans in their colonies, and an even greater desire to achieve independence and recognition as independent states. And you're going to see this play out in virtually every place that Europeans have colonized. And we'll look at just a couple of examples. But in general, the colonies had learned some very valuable lessons from this war. And much like in World War I, one of those lessons is European mortality. They see in this war that Europeans are not invincible, that they can be defeated, they can be weakened, they can be overthrown. They see this with, the Japanese capturing, imprisoning, executing European soldiers. They see this in the colonial soldiers that are sent to the front lines to fight and then have to shoot at and shoot other European soldiers. The Europeans lose this whole mystique of the white man's burden that they had going for them during the age of imperialism. They lose this notion of them up on a pedestal compared to everybody else, and look how much better we are. War tends to bring out the worst in people as often or more often than it brings out the best. And so the colonies got a front row seat to all of this. It only helped to strengthen their nationalistic goals. Again, nationalism, believing in the greatness of your country, and in the event that your country happens to be owned by somebody else, the intense desire for your freedom and independence to then go and show how great your country can be under its own power. One of the biggest reasons why the colonies are finally freed, though, from European control is the Europeans just don't have the physical, emotional, or financial energy to maintain their control. Because again, to keep control of the colonies, who and what do you have to have? People.
Money.
And money. And in many cases, you need soldiers.
You need motivation.
Right. You need people that believe in what they're doing, or at least can be paid enough to believe in what they're doing. And in either case, you don't have a whole lot of volunteers to continue to do military service in the colonies where people want to kill them because they want their independence. Going from one war zone to another just is not that attractive. And so many of these colonies will gain their independence simply because the Europeans don't have the strength to keep them anymore. And you're going to see this play out in a variety of ways. In India, you're going to see a slightly more peaceful and democratic path taken. The Indian National Congress will form as a political party representing the wishes and desires and nationalistic ideology of the Indian people. And they will use political and diplomatic pressure to try to get the British to pack up and leave. On their way out, when the British do finally leave, they decide that as a parting gift, they are going to solve India's religious dispute. And they will partition India. This all used to be what the British considered to be India. When they leave, they're going to take this western portion, they're going to call it Pakistan, they're going to tell all the Muslims living in India, you should go there, and all the Hindus should go to India proper. And look, that'll solve all of your religious problems. We're out of here. Peace. And peace is not so much what takes place.
Does it solve the religious problem?
Not even close.
Just means, you know,
Because, A, some people don't want to leave. Yeah. All of that eastern territory goes through a very complicated and convoluted process of subdividing into different nations. The British play some role in getting the ball rolling, but then it's really taken up by the different ethnic groups that then want to be separate, not only from the British, but also from India itself. And the person that hopefully most of you know by this point, Gandhi, is going to be one of the most visible leaders of the movement, first to get the British out and then to attempt to create peace between Muslims and Hindus. He will actually be assassinated by a Hindu man who didn't like his take on tolerance towards Muslims. But you see India as a far more peaceful example of resistance against Europeans than you do in some places in Africa, where the preferred method of resistance and evicting the Europeans is full-on conflict. You guys saw this in one of the DBQs that we looked at earlier in the year, responses to European imperialism. Many, many nations in Africa preferred to fight back militarily. In many cases that did not go well, but even with those losses, it in no way lessened their desire to fight their way free. Again, for the Europeans, it becomes just too much to hold on to, too costly, too draining, and they are forced to leave. You'll see a number of rebellions that help to kick them out. One of the fun ones, just because it's fun to say, not because it was fun to be involved in, but in Kenya, you have a revolutionary leader named Jomo Kenyatta, who leads the Mau Mau uprising. I told you, it's fun to say. And that will be just one of many examples of African peoples rising up and physically resisting against European colonial powers. South Africa will see resistance not only between the British, who are finally removed, but also the residual Boer population that had come from the Netherlands and were still there. And so even once the British are kicked out, there is still this white-black conflict as the Boers, who now call themselves Afrikaners, attempt to hold on to power in South Africa. And they do it. And they create a system of apartheid, racial separation.
How bad is it compared to the U.S.?
In some cases, far worse. And lasts far longer. Apartheid only ends in the 1990s. And so obviously, and we've talked about this before, you can end laws a whole lot quicker than you can end people's perspectives and opinions. And so it was a really big deal for South Africa to host the World Cup and on an international stage try to show how far they've come. But even following the World Cup, we saw things in the news about, strikes in mines and African workers being gunned down and very little being done in the judicial process about it. So we're still seeing the fallout from European imperialism in Africa even to this day. You see the propensity for warlords to seize power and hold power. You see how often Africa suffers from ethnic genocide as one tribal group attempts to get back at the other for years of oppression when the Europeans supported one side over the other. You saw this in Rwanda, you see it in Sudan, you see it in any number of African nations. And much like we've seen throughout history, except now it's playing out in front of our eyes, military figures are often the best able to gain power after the earlier government falls away. We saw it in Mexico with the caudillos. We saw it in China with the warlords. We saw it in Japan with the daimyo and the samurai. We've seen it time after time after time. It just seems really, really different because it's happening in the 21st century in Africa as we watch it on TV. And then one of the last things to talk about is the formation of Israel. At the end of World War I, there was a group of Jews called Zionists that had gone to the League of Nations and to the British and the United States and had asked for a Jewish homeland to be created. And they were approved and then quickly rejected, and then quickly the decision was just kind of tabled for a while because it seemed like it made everybody mad. But now in the wake of World War II and the full effect of the Holocaust being brought to light, the Allied powers feel obligated to create this Jewish homeland and to give in to, and not give in, but to agree with the will of the Zionist movement to restore a Jewish homeland where Jews can go and be safe and be the majority. And so the United Nations approves partitioning this area called Palestine on the very eastern end of the Mediterranean, northeast of Egypt. The UN agrees to partition, just like India and Pakistan, partition Palestine into a Jewish homeland called Israel, and the remaining areas to be left to Palestine. And again, the problem with that is it's already occupied. And so just like in India and Pakistan, you have conflict between people that don't want to leave but are now told they have to. And two governments that then become opposed to each other because they're supposed to represent different ideologies. And you're going to see the same thing happen between Israel and Palestine, as the Jews will now fiercely claim this new homeland and attempt to give their people some security and safety after the horrors of the Holocaust. And most of the other nations in that part of the world see Israel as a threat and want to retake that land that had just been theirs And Israel feels equally determined and justified in fighting to defend that land, and in some cases even expand upon it if they can. And they do. Which, again, is part of what leads to the continued tension that we have even today. Alia?
Is like Palestine a territory or like it's not a country?
Right. Palestine has a tricky designation because there are any number of nations that don't want to recognize Palestine's legitimacy. The United Nations even continues to struggle with how to recognize them, either as a territory, as a nation state, as a nation, and there's all these fun political terms that have varying degrees of grayness attached to them in terms of what you are and therefore what you can do and not do. And that's still a question that's being wrestled with literally today. Nick?
Why does every nation that borders Israel hate it with a violent passion?
Well, largely because all of the nations that bordered Israel were impacted by the eviction of the Palestinian people that were living there when Israel was created. And because most of that area is Muslim, they felt more of a commonality with the Palestinian people than they did with the Jewish people. And that's like the incredibly oversimplified 5-second answer to a question that has been wrestled with for 50 some odd years now.
Why is Israel always
Well, Israel has the benefit of being a close ally with the United States during its creation and early years, and we give them all manner of military technology to help them maintain their independence. And so when they have state-of-the-art fighter planes and artillery and, infantry weaponry, that's hard to compete against. Now, what all this is going to lead to as we come back to the Western world is the upcoming conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States. Two fundamentally different ideologies. Again, it seems to keep coming back to this. The United States and its democratic and capitalist values versus the Soviet Union and its totalitarian government and communist economic philosophy. And this is not one of those things where people feel like, oh yeah, we disagree, I like blue and you like purple, we'll just call it a day. Both sides see this as a fundamental threat to their own existence. If you think the best form of government is having a single all-powerful ruler in power and taking all of society's resources and distributing it evenly across the population, and you think the best form of government is to let every man and woman in your country, no matter their educational background or their intellect or their opinion, let all of them have a vote and let people succeed or fail largely on their own merits so that you have very wealthy people and homeless people living in the same city. I mean, do you see how those don't really work together? Those two ideas really can't coexist. And unfortunately, what's going to happen during the immediate aftermath of World War II is they are going to be literally placed side by side, almost like a science experiment. Two petri dishes. We're going to see which one grows and which one doesn't. And from there, this conflict will continue and grow as each side tries to prove its dominance, ideologically as well as economically, politically, militarily, all of it. Nick?
Now, this is about the startup of the Cold War and how they were placed right next to each other.
Mm-hmm.
Why did the Soviet Union not go and leave the territories it occupied in Eastern Europe from the Nazis like the Western Allies did with the France and their parts?
Oh, that's another really complicated answer. The overly simplified version is they felt entitled to it. And again, they felt like they could do a better job of rebuilding it than the Allies could. And they really wanted it. And they already controlled it, so it's one of those possession is 9/10 of the law kind of things. Okay, that ends chapter 31. Any last minute questions?
Who are the people on the box?
On the left is Kennedy. On the right, anybody know?
Khrushchev.
Very good, Khrushchev. And in the box is the monster that will become the threat of nuclear war which is going to really be one of the leading characters in the story of the Cold War. All right, so that'll be the next chapter.